Well, what do we have here? Very well, a philosophy that tries to consolidate the mind and the body. It originated from the novels of Ayn Rand, where she described objectivism by stating that my philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. Thus the name Objectivism was derived from the statement that human knowledge and values are objective and can only be perceived through inductive logic. In actuality, why she chooses the name Objectivism was because Soren Kierkegaard and the existentialist boys had already used the name Existentialism, so she was forced to choose the next best alternative. Anyhow, let's start with the metaphysics first. Roll the transition, editor. Her philosophy is based on the three assumptions of existence, consciousness, and reality. She defined existence as self-evident through perception. Existence was an identity where an entity is made of specific characteristics. If an object has no such characteristics or identity, then it does not exist. God. This law of identity differentiated one object from another. Rand writes, "A leaf cannot be all red and green at the same time. It cannot freeze and burn at the same time. A is A." While consciousness is the capability of perceiving existence, so without an independent reality, consciousness cannot be conceptualized. From this follows that the mind does not create reality, but it discovers it instead, which means that existence exists before the mind, while how an entity acts is caused by the identity of this entity. For example, why you get low scores on the test is due to the fact that your brain is small. As previously stated, that existence is identity. Consequently, another statement follows, stating that consciousness is identification. Rand argues that reason and the mind is what makes us understand what one sense is. She proclaimed that the fundamental concept of method, the one on which all others depend, is logic. Objectivism states that all knowledge is based on perception, thus senses are the bridge that leads to undeniable truths. All arguments that appear to be true but are not true tend to fall victim to the logical fallacy of a self-defeating idea. See this tone? Well, this is the explanation of a self-defeating argument. Rand proclaims that perception is incapable of error, as it is determined psychologically. An optical illusion is an error in the conceptual identification instead of the error in sight. Similarly, you didn't lose weight, but you are just wearing black clothes, you little fatty. The validity of sense perception is susceptible to proof, because all proofs use sensory perception as evidence. Rand also rejected Kant's idea of things we perceive and things in themselves, as what one perceives is the actual form that it takes. I perceive an apple as red, then apple must be red. She wrote that the attack on man's consciousness, and particularly on his conceptual faculty, has rested on the unchallenged premise that any knowledge acquired by a process of consciousness is necessarily subjective and cannot correspond to the facts of reality. Since it is processed knowledge, but all knowledge is processed knowledge, whether on the sensory, perceptual, or conceptual level. An unprocessed knowledge would be a knowledge acquired without means of cognition. Rand also rejected feelings as sources of knowledge, as it was not something that a human perceives, but what his consciousness already accepts. Looks like she took the statement that logic does not care about your feelings too seriously. The intellectual heir of Rand, Leonard Peikoff, states that if a human has all the evidence, then it can be certain of all the knowledge. Thus humans are only dumb due to limited knowledge and vulnerability to error. Thank you for stating that I'm stupid in such a kind manner. Rand extensively covers the ethical side of objectivism in her books We the Living, Atlas Shrugged, and The Virtue of Selfishness, where morality is the codes that define a man's life. One should not ask what moral values are needed, but whether human needs moral values at all. The answer by Rand was that why human needs values were because he was a living entity. It is further argued that free will primarily was used for choosing to think or not to think. In every single moment, an individual could make the conscious decision of focusing and thinking, or instead just remaining in a state of unconscious daze. Consequently, a person first chooses to think and then proceeds to fulfill his life. As she stated, that man has the power to act as his own destroyer, and that is the way he has acted through most of his history. Similarly, this choice of thinking applies to all aspects of life. A man is given a life, but he chooses to survive. A man is given a body, but he chooses to sustain it. A man is given a brain, but he chooses to develop it. All of these choices come from rational thinking, which is essential at judging moral values. All of this leads to the endorsement of self-interest, where an individual's foremost moral obligation is to survive and promote self-sustenance. Thus, the ethics of objectivism lie hand in hand with rational egoism. While being against the philosophy of altruism, where one lives for the sake of others, while objectivism also rejects hedonism, because human under such circumstances is not motivated to live his own life for the sake of it, but rather for the pleasures it provides. Ah man, they also rejected hedonism. Well, there goes my reason to support objectivism then. Art is important to objectivism. Why, you ask? Well, art helps humans to understand the reality around them. This reality is a metaphysical judgment of an artist, what he perceives as truth and reality, therefore making the abstract concepts understandable. Man intakes all of these truths and understandings of other humans to create his own comprehensive conceptual framework. This ultimately makes art an effective way to communicate a moral or an ethical idea. Rand's own artistic efforts were used to portray the ideal man, especially in Fountainhead, where her main protagonist embodies the concept of a higher man. Rand also admitted that Romanticist art was the highest form of art, as it recognized the primary principle of free will. She added that what the Romanticist brought to art was the primacy of values. Values are the source of emotions. A great deal of emotional intensity was projected in the work of Romanticists and the reactions of their audiences, as well as great deal of color, imagination, originality, excitement, and all the other consequences of a value-oriented view of life. After hearing so much about how important an individual is, then we should all already know that she was a firm backer of individual liberty. An individual survived by using his rationality, and this rationality was suppressed under government or criminal force. Rand pointed out that a man's mind will not function at the point of a gun. If a person was rational, then he would choose persuasion, but if he lacks the rational capability, then he will proceed to use force. Well, now I know why my parents use force instead of persuasion. Objectivism claims that to be morally right, one needs to use reason, as each individual has a right to follow his judgment and efforts. While the objectivist viewed government as significant as it provided legislation that assisted in controlling unnecessary physical force, thus protecting individual rights. Thus the government was an agent which had no rights other than the ones delegated by the people. Rand did not accept any anarchist measures, as it would lead to the loss of control over the police and judicial courts, which were also necessary for the protection of rights. Rand's philosophy played a significant role in influencing the libertarians and American conservatives. Even though she wasn't that popular with academic philosophers, critics dismissed Rand as a shallow thinker, appealing only to adolescents. Furthermore, the critics of her philosophy described objectivism as a youthful idealism, where young people grow out of this philosophy eventually, ultimately abandoning the ideas of objectivism. A moral philosopher, David Sidorsky, expressed that objectivism was more of an ideology rather than a comprehensive philosophy. Rand has rejected many things, so in return she gets rejected by everyone. Now how about that? Although her philosophy was not acknowledged by the academia, but remained popular with the college campuses, many students promoted and studied Objectivism, which helped them in the future to shape their own philosophies. As Objectivism itself stated, that different types of art assisted to create an individual's comprehensive conceptual framework. Similarly, Rand's philosophy has played its role in developing many people's intellectual framework.
Randism, and I don't like that name. I call it Objectivism.
All right.
Meaning a philosophy based on objective reality. Now let me explain it as briefly as I can. First, my philosophy is based on